Okay, thank you for coming out, everybody. So just looking ahead before we get started for tonight, next month we've got John Kreitcher coming in. It'll be the last of our winter Zoom meetings. And John will be discussing a new book that he has coming out. And then ahead of that, in March, we've got this brand new ornithology professor at UMass, just hired, named Nathan Senner. Specialty is, I think, long distance shorebird migration. So he hasn't told me a specific topic yet, but I will try to pin him down on that soon. April, we've got a familiar name from years past, Joan Walsh of Massachusetts Audubon Society. She'll be talking about Mass Audubon's conservation program for roseate terns and other colonial nesting seabirds. And then our last kind of presentation type program of the year, which, by the way, so March and April we'll be back meeting in person at the church in Hadley for Nathan, Joan, and in May for Matt Kelly, who'll be talking about TNT, which is his abbreviation for Trinidad and Tobago. And then in June, we will be replacing our usual meeting program and slideshow with a picnic. So out at Arcadia. So we will, and we'll hope for better weather for that than we got when we tried it back in September. So that's what we have coming up for the rest of our programs this year. As for tonight, I want to remind everyone, let's see, to first off, please keep your sound muted during the program. Secondly, if you have any questions during the program, you can post them in the chat column so that you don't have to risk forgetting what your question was by the time the end of the talk comes around. But when our speaker is done, then I will go through the chat column. I'll read the questions that have been posted there for him to answer, and you'll have chances to ask more questions at the end of the program, end of the meeting as well. So post your questions in the chat whenever they pop into your mind. Okay, and I think that brings us to tonight's speaker. So tonight we're going to be talking about the identification of gulls, a topic that sends many bird watchers often kind of skulking off into the bushes looking for a sparrow or a warbler or something, and not wanting to deal. So we're gonna get some advice on how to deal with gull identification from someone who's become kind of a nationally recognized expert and a bit of an evangelist on the wonders of gulls and the best techniques for identifying them. He's a native of Chicago, and so all around the Great Lakes is just fantastic gull collections. So he's had great opportunities to study all of them around there. And he has a blog, Anything Laris. He runs a Facebook group, Gull Identification of North America. He's got a book in progress, The Gull Guide. How many is that? What's the prognosis on that coming out, Amar? Is it 10 years, 2 years?
Oh, well, it's been 8 years in the making, but we should hopefully have a publication date this summer. But it probably isn't until late 2024 at least.
All right, we'll keep our fingers crossed. You have to let me know, and I'll spread the word to the
Absolutely.
Club here when it's coming out. And then you said next month you've got an article in North American Birds about variation in Thayer gulls, you said.
Correct, yes. Next month, North American Birds.
All right, so I guess I'll turn it over to our speaker, Amar Ayyash. So, Amar, it's all yours.
Thank you, Josh. How does this look? Is this the good screen, folks?
It looks great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Josh, everything sound right on your end?
Yep, so far so good.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Talk about gulls in January. I'm very excited to do this. I do this regularly. I was in St. John's, Newfoundland last week, where I saw this species, maybe a couple hundred of them. Anybody know what this is here? Short black legs. Not many gulls with short black legs. Has kind of this black hind collar. It happens to be the most gregarious gull species in the world. There's about 14 million of these worldwide. So our most abundant gull. Any takers here? So if you're saying black-legged kittiwake, it definitely is a black-legged kittiwake. This is a juvenile, or what some would call a first cycle. So I'll just explain right out the gate here what a first cycle is versus a second cycle. It's very similar to saying first year or second year. But when we talk about cycles, we're referring specifically to the plumage and the molt that is in action. So when a bird replaces all of its juvenile primaries, all of its juvenile flight feathers, it's no longer juvenile. It's in its second molt cycle when it begins to replace those flight feathers. So any bird that's replacing flight feathers in North America is in its second cycle. So these gulls that hatched just back in 2022 are all first cycles right now. And starting around May, June, they'll start to replace their flight feathers. And at that time, we'll be calling those birds second cycles. So anywho, this black-legged kittiwake was actually photographed in Chicago. And this is a bird that was really tame, just letting joggers and passerbys get within feet of it. And when you ever see a pelagic bird that tame and that relaxed, it usually means they're not in good shape. And so it got to the point where this bird got really lethargic, couldn't even move. So we collected it and took it to a rehab center, unfortunately, and ended up dying that night. But we collected it, and the specimen is now in the Chicago Field Museum. The thing with black-legged kittiwakes is they really belong on the ocean. So anytime you see them on freshwater, they're either lost or sick and trying to get back to the sea. As far as diversity in gulls, maybe some of you have seen this slide before. There's a bit of diversity. I mean, we don't have the best songs and the best colors, but as far as sizes and shapes and ecology, there's a good amount of diversity here. I was talking to Josh before the talk, and I know you guys get inland ring-billed gulls and herring gulls, but you might get some Bonapartes as well. And those I'm going to come back to because those are really benchmark species for the people who live out east. Does everybody recognize 2A? 2A, row 2, column A? So that is indeed a ring-billed gull, pale eye, and it has this pretty broad black band on the bill tip. Ring-bills never show red on the bill, so that's a constant, and there aren't many constants in gull identification, but ring-billed gulls have never been recorded with red on their bill. So that red on the bill is called a Gony's spot, and this one in the center here has a pretty big Gony's spot. The Gony's is spelled G-O-N-Y-S. And it's thought that it's evolved to help the young peck at the parent's bill in order to prompt them to regurgitate some type of food for them. And if you've ever watched gulls on a nest, they actually do peck at that red spot. And oftentimes the parents will regurgitate food. So it's kind of a loose theory because then, you know, what about the other gulls that don't have red on the bill? The same thing happens. The young peck at the parents' bills and they still get fed. So there must be other reasons why these gulls have red on their bill. Another one you should recognize is 2B, right next to the ring-billed. This guy with the earmuffs here. This is an adult Bonaparte's gull, and it's in non-breeding plumage. You might hear this referred to as basic plumage. So a bird can be in basic plumage, which is equivalent to non-breeding plumage, or it can be in alternate plumage. Alternate plumage you might equate with breeding plumage. So basic, non-breeding, alternate, breeding. In fact, all of these gulls, I would say, maybe 90% of them appear to be in basic plumage. When you see this head streaking and these head markings, that's, ordinarily non-breeding or basic plumage. Now, this one here, 2C, apparently I thought was more rare in the interior in your state, but this is laughing gull, and it too is in basic plumage, so it doesn't have its hood, has kind of this long, heavy, droopy bill compared to a Bonaparte's. Laughing gulls span all the way down to South America, so they're breeding in places like Brazil, Venezuela, Panama. So they're not just in North America. Biggest congregation of wintering laughing gulls would be found down in Florida, down in Daytona Beach shores. You can see up to 100,000 laughing gulls in a stretch of a couple miles. So very common down there at this time of year. So herring gull, which one's the herring gull? This is where it gets kind of challenging, folks, because all of these other large white-headed gulls with yellow bills, there's a lot of overlap and the variation in their head sizes, their bill shape. The herring gull in this slide is 3A, right underneath the ring-billed. And there's nothing really special about a herring gull. They can have square heads, rounded heads, blocky heads. Their bills can be, in general, medium size compared to things like great blackback and glaucus, or western gulls. If you go out west, western gulls and glaucus wing gulls, they generally have thicker, bigger bills than herring gulls. But headshot is really not enough to identify these birds. In this group here, we have small, medium, large, and these would be benchmark species for us in the East. The large one with pink legs in the back here, that's a herring gull. And I know we need more. Now we need the bill, we need the eye. The one in the center here with mustard yellow legs, that's a ring-billed. They have yellow legs as adults. And the smaller one here with reddish legs, that's a Bonaparte's. And all three of these species have about the same coloration of gray under upper parts. This is what we classify as a pale gray. These are pale gray backed species. They're very important benchmarks for us because usually when Eastern field guides are describing gulls, they use these three as benchmarks. So Bonaparte's is often compared to little gull and sabins and the kittiwakes. Ring-billed is often compared to mew gull and things like common gull. And then herrings are often compared to some of the bigger things like Iceland's and glaucus in California. You see at the top there 2-year, 3-year, 4-year gulls. And again, that simply means the number of years it takes or the number of molt cycles it takes to acquire an adult-like appearance. And when gulls take on their adult-like appearance, that's pretty much permanent. They don't go back to any retarded or juvenile state. They remain adults for the rest of their lives. So you might not know the difference between a 6-year-old herring gull and a 30-year-old herring gull because they would essentially look the same. So in general, we'd think of gulls as two big groups. There's the large white-headed gulls, there's that category, and the small tern-like gulls. And most birders in general tend to get excited about the small tern-like gulls. and you're probably one of them. Some of these things you might recognize, like Sabin's gull and ivory gull and Ross's. Among these smaller tern-like gulls are some of the most coveted bird species in the world. So I'm just going to pause here for a minute and let you take in this eye candy. Starting at the top right, all white, black legs, a grayish bill. This is a really unique bill. There's not any other gull that has a grayish bill base with a yellow tip. This is an ivory gull, an adult ivory gull. And we never know when they're in breeding or non-breeding plumage because they're always white as adults. They don't take on head streaking, and they never happen to change leg color or bill color. On the bottom right is a little gull. This is our smallest gull in the world. We have a gull about the size of a robin, if you can believe that. Little gulls are about the size of a robin. Wingspan is about the same. Tiny bill, small domed head, and very short legs. If you look here at the underside of the far wing, you see this black here. That's typically a good field mark. It's quite diagnostic because no other gull shows black on the underwing. Top left, this is the cousin of little gull. This is Ross's gull. The Europeans place these two in the same genus, but the AOS has these two in separate genera. Black necklace, white head. Ross's gull actually has a smaller bill than little gull. Ross's gull has the smallest bill of all gulls. This is an Arctic nester. This is one of our rarest birds in the world. I've seen adults, I've seen juveniles. They're incredible birds. They live in very harsh conditions. What they do, for the most part, is just find pack ice and find anywhere they can rest out at sea. And them, along with ivory gulls, feed on plankton. Ivory gulls tend to feed more on seal carcasses or whatever carcass they can find in the Arctic. But my favorite, on the bottom left here, with the smoky gray hood and a thin black necklace, these big white apical spots on the primaries here, yellow bill tip. This is Sabin's gull, arguably the prettiest gull, especially when you see an open wing, and I'll show you an open wing in a moment. Sabin's gull is a trans-equatorial migrant. So these things go from the Arctic all the way down to southern South America. Some of them winter off the coasts of Chile and Peru. Some of them go and winter off the coasts of South Africa, in Africa. So our North American Sabin's gulls will be found on both oceans in the northern winter. Longest migration of any gull. Longest migration of any gull. A little quiz here, and I specifically chose these first cycle birds, these first year birds, because they're the ones that look kind of subtly the same. Our field guides do a pretty good job with the adults. The adults are, for the most part, straightforward. If you see an adult Ross's, you're probably not going to misidentify it, or an adult Sabin's, you'll probably do okay with it. It's these first cycles. They all have what we call M patterns on the back. If you see this, what looks like an M across the upper wing. The Europeans call these W patterns. We call them M patterns. If you look at the shapes and the boldness of these M patterns, they're pretty distinctive. So this one here, species A, has a really bold M pattern, very dark and thick. This one in the middle, species B, has a really weak M pattern. In fact, it breaks right here. There's these white headlights. We should know those. When you see these white headlights, it's usually species B, and I'll reveal the names in just a moment here. I'm giving you a moment to guess the names. There's this one here, our most abundant gull in the world. We've already seen that one on the cover slide. It has this thick black hind collar, continuous M pattern. The M pattern doesn't break at the wrist here, so that's continuous. All right, should we reveal the names here? Everybody have a guess? So little gull has the bold carpal bar. Bonaparte's has the white headlights at the wrists there. And kittiwake has an all white trailing edge. So kittiwake has this trailing edge to the flight feathers that's all white. It's always going to be white. Bonaparte's, on the other hand, has an all black trailing edge, and it'll always be black. And then little gull is variable. Sometimes it can be darker than this. Sometimes it can be paler. It's just all over the board. These are fun. Usually 2-year species. They're very tern-like, agile birds. If you ever see them in pursuit of one another, they chase each other. They chase terns. They get chased by Jaegers. Usually these are the gulls that Jaegers are going after. They're going after the smaller gulls. So can you guys guess what two we have here? They are 2 different species. One has a bold carpal bar, a bold M pattern. And the other one has what looks like a break in the M pattern, headlights. And there's definitely a little size difference here. So this is little gull, and this one is Bonaparte's gull. Okay, moving along here, underwing quiz. Look at this trailing edge from the body all the way to the wingtip. There's this thin tail band, ear muffs. That's a Bonaparte's. That's a Bonaparte's. That trailing edge is a giveaway. This one here has a thick hind collar. All white trailing edge, so there's no pigment here along the back end of the wing. That's a black-legged kittiwake, but the funny thing about it is it doesn't have black legs. And about 1 out of 30 kittiwakes don't have black legs. They have this kind of brown, fleshy colored leg color. It's really weird. Black-legged kittiwake without black legs. All right, something a little bit bigger. How about hooded gulls? When we say hooded gulls, we're usually referring to Franklin's and laughing. These two are a confusion pair. They're often confused everywhere across the continent. Laughing gull is common on the coast, on the East Coast along the Atlantic. Franklin's gull is more of an interior species. They migrate right through the center of the continent. They go up to the plains, the Great Basin. They nest up in the Canadian provinces in the center of Canada. They also migrate to South America in the winter. They're kind of like Sabin's gull. They're our only other gull that has this trans-equatorial migration. But there are some obvious differences. Franklin's gull has what we call a medial band. If you see this white partition right here, it goes from gray, white, and then a black wingtip. Whereas laughing just goes from black straight to gray. There is no white medial band. You guys are fortunate because if one of these does pop up in the interior, it could be either one of them. And the same thing goes with where I'm from. I'm from Illinois, where they're about equally common. We'll get, a dozen Franklins every year, and we'll get about a dozen laughing gulls every year. Might be less common for you guys. But sitting down, when they're perched, laughing is a bigger bird, slightly bigger bill, droopier bill. Looks a little more inflated. And Franklin's always tends to keep this kind of semi-hooded look. If you notice that, that's almost true with every Franklin's. They have kind of this half-hooded look, even when they're in non-breeding plumage. And they have thicker white eye crescents. These white eye crescents are very bold on Franklin's, not so much on laughing. In flight, there are some first-year Franklins. This is a first cycle that actually shows very little white on this medial band. And that's just an age-related field mark. It's nothing to worry about. What I would take from this photo is this Franklin's gull is showing bold white eye crescents, and it's showing this semi-hooded appearance, like a half hood, and it's bald in the front here. So Here's a young Franklin's with some laughing gulls. Can you identify the Franklin's gull? Bold eye crescents, semi-hooded appearance. This one here is our Franklin's gull. Upper wing looks a lot like laughing gull. And that's not what we would be looking at. We would be looking at those eye crescents, the hood pattern, and the bill as well. If you notice, this laughing gull has kind of a longer, droopier bill, shorter, more petite bill on Franklin's. I know you're looking at this laughing gull right next to it. There is some variation here, folks. This laughing gull has a pretty small bill. And that's why we take these things like bill size, body size as secondary field marks. They're not diagnostic. They can help and support an ID. But with gulls, usually plumage will trump size. Usually plumage will trump size because body size is so variable. These are young hooded gulls in flight. This one on the left is a Franklin's gull. I want you to notice the tail band, kind of a narrow tail band. It doesn't reach the outer edges. You have white on the outer edges of the tail, whereas in young laughing gulls, they have pretty thick tail bands, dark tail base, and the black goes from one edge to the outer edge. But again, I want you to notice this hooded pattern and bold eye crescents. Even from a distance, those eye crescents tend to pop. Okay, so those are our small gulls, our hooded gulls. Things that I think with a little bit of effort, most people tend to nail okay. It's usually the large white-headed gulls, our four-year gulls, your so-called seagull that most people want to know more about when it comes to identification. Some people want nothing to do with these birds. I have good friends of mine in Chicago who the last thing they want to do is go look at a large gull, unless it's something rare like a slaty-back gull or a Vega gull, then everybody jumps on that immediately. But LWHG just stands for large white-headed gulls because they have white heads and they're large. GBBG is great black-back gull, which you guys have on the coast, and sometimes they come in the interior. LBBG is lesser black-back gull, which is a smaller version of great black-back gull. I'll talk about both of those in more detail. But when approaching these large white-headed gulls, folks, the number one thing to do is allow for variation. And the number two thing to do is allow for variation. And then number three, allow for variation. What sort of variation are we talking about? Size variation, which I already mentioned. It's a real thing with large white-headed gulls. Males tend to be about 15 to 30% larger than their female counterparts. So a ring-billed gull like this male on the right can easily look 30% larger than this female on the left. This is the breeding season, so we know when they pair up, it's a great time of the year to watch them in April, May. You can tell immediately which one is male, which one is female. But they tend to have deeper voices, definitely thicker necks, bigger heads, bigger bills, even thicker legs. These two here, great black-back gulls, our biggest gull species in the world, darkest black species we have in North America, pink legs. One of these is male, one of these is female. These two adults were watching us as we banded their chicks on Appledore Island in Maine. So we know which one is male and which one is female, just based on their head size and bill. Would you guess which one was male? So definitely the one on the left here in the front is our male, blocky head, quite a hefty bill, and then the thinner bill, smaller, skinnier neck there, smaller head is our female. Great black-back gulls. One thing that often happens with these large white-headed gulls is behavior and posture can definitely change the shape and structure of a gull. And not just gulls, any bird in general. But it has implications when it comes to ID, because if somebody were to send me the photo on the left, I would say, oh, that looks like a male, has kind of a flat crown, bulgy body. And the one on the right looks kind of dove-headed, more gentle, more docile. But these are the same bird. This bird was photographed just a couple minutes apart in a parking lot here in Illinois. It's a third-year herring gull or a third cycle herring gull. It's definitely not an adult, and we know this because it has these markings on the tertials, all this brown on the wing coverts. So adults tend to have all solid gray upper parts. They don't show all this black on the bill. And these white apical spots, these white spots that we're seeing here on the primary tips, they tend to be larger and bolder in adults. So at any rate, I just want you to take note here that posture, behavior changes the shape of a bird, not just gulls, but sometimes that difference is real. If you look on the left here, this is a herring gull. It's a second cycle or second year. This is also a herring gull, and it's an adult. And look at the size difference there. So I'm going to erase what I have written here. And I just want you to take that in and compare their bodies and their bill size. This is not an illusion. That's a big bird on the left. And there's this misconception that older birds get bigger or adults are bigger. And usually when a gull fledges and leaves the nest, it's oftentimes larger than its parents or heavier than its parents. So once that bird is out of the nest, it's about the size of an adult. The only thing that continues growing is the bill and sometimes the outermost primaries, the outermost wingtip. But body size, they're just as big as adults, as juveniles. You guys, pink legs on these herring gulls, and adults have pale eyes and pale gray upper parts. If you're asking, so why is the one on the left a second cycle and not like a juvenile, for example? It has pale eyes already. And these primaries that we're seeing, these wingtips here, these are second generation feathers. So we definitely don't want to call that a first year bird. It's a second year bird. It already has all this gray on the back. So second year herring gull. Here are a couple more herring gulls. This one's a herring gull, first year. This one's a herring gull, adult. But what is this big pale bird with a pink bill base and a black tip? That's a big bird. Part of this might be an illusion or might be photographic effect, but I think that's a big bird. Does anybody know what that is? This is a first cycle glaucous gull. Glaucous gull, they're Arctic species, and they come down in small numbers in the winter. Now's a good time to see them. Usually we get more first cycles than adults. The first cycles tend to move farther south. And this is our second largest gull species in the world. But there are 3 to 4 subspecies worldwide. The nominate race, we get Hyperboreus. Hyperboreus is the nominate subspecies, which we get in Eastern North America. They tend to be pretty big. There's a bigger one in Asia and Russia called Pallidissimus. They're pretty big, but there is size variation. As you can see here, this one on the left is also a first cycle glaucous gull, pink bill base, black tip, all creamy, pale upper parts with a herring gull, and they look about the same size here. So what we might assume here is this herring gull might be a male, and this glaucous gull might just be a female glaucous gull. So it's kind of like, you know, female sharp-shinned, male Coopers kind of thing. Because we expect glaucous gull to be bigger than herring gull all the time. And that's generally true unless you have some sex overlap here. So another glaucous gull right here on the left, pink bill base, big bird, pale upper parts. And this one with the black bill is an Iceland gull. And the subspecies of Iceland gull that we get is Kumlines. Kumlines, K-U-M-L-I-E-N'-S, named after ornithologists by the name of Kumlin. from Wisconsin, incidentally. So this is a subspecies of Iceland gull that breeds in northern Canada. The dominant race breeds in Greenland and winters off the coast of Greenland and Iceland, but there are no Iceland gulls that actually breed in Iceland. They only winter there, and we get the darker Canadian subspecies. Recently, Thayer's gull, which was a good species for a long time, Thayer's gull was lumped with the Iceland gulls, so now it's the darkest and largest subspecies of Iceland gull, and they tend to winter primarily off of southern Alaska down to California. A big stronghold for Thayer's gull by the thousands is Vancouver Island in British Columbia. You can see hundreds and hundreds of them feeding on the herring roe in the spring, but more numbers than we get on the Great Lakes or anywhere else in North America. So these two are often confused. Just keep the bill pattern in mind. Our Kumleen's gulls, for the most part, keep mostly a black bill in the winter. Glaucus gulls, by the time we see them in October, November, they already have this bicolored bill, and they're just much larger. Okay, some adults here. This is fun because we have 3 different species here. Let's start with the big one, the pale one. There is one that's a so-called white-winger. That white-winged species there, that's a glaucus gull. That's a glaucus in adult plumage. You won't see any pigment on the wingtip. So this is the wingtip right here. It's going to be all white. And the gray upper parts are truly pale. This is our palest large white-headed gull. That's a very, very pale gray. Compare that to the herring gulls here. Herring gulls are pale gray, but they're a little bit darker than glaucus gull. So it's a good comparison at a distance, size, and the color of the upper parts. All right, what about the blackback gull? This one. Could that be a great blackback? Probably not. Size-wise, that should be bigger than the herring gulls, and just about as big as a glaucus gull, if not bigger, depending on the sex. So that blackback gull in the east, it would be safe for us to assume is a lesser blackback gull, and that's what it was. It's a lesser blackback gull. They're about a smidgen smaller than herring gulls, but there are some lesser blackback gulls that are just as big as herring, if not bigger. Check out the leg color here. Our adult lesser blackback gulls have yellow legs. So anywhere in the east where you see a blackback gull with yellow legs, it's probably lesser blackback. If you get, places out west like the Salton Sea in California, they have yellow-footed gull. Yellow-footed gull can look like this, but they have much, much more bulbous tip bills. Lesser blackback has a pretty straight bill for the most part. It's not very thick on the tip. So lesser blackback is somewhat of an enigma in North America because, just 30, 40 years ago, this was a rare bird alert. Somebody find a lesser blackback. People were getting in their car and crossing state lines to go see lesser blackback gull. And now they've made it all the way out to the Pacific coast. They're in California in small numbers, in Washington, British Columbia. They're pretty common in the winter in Colorado. This is really weird because we don't know where they're nesting. The closest place they nest is in Southwest Greenland. And there's been no confirmed nesting of a lesser blackback pair anywhere in Canada or the United States. And really close to you guys, Virginia, Pennsylvania, they get these things in the hundreds. Florida in the winter can get, I've been down to some landfills where we can see 200-300 lesser blackback gulls in one flock. Yet they're not breeding, or at least they haven't been confirmed breeding anywhere, which is pretty astonishing. Variation in size, variation in plumage. This is a lot of fun when you get into plumage variation. You can spend a lifetime just wondering what is it that causes two herring gulls that probably came from the same colony to have completely different color plumages? So you're looking at two first cycle herrings. These are Great Lakes birds. This is what our Great Lakes herrings look like. But one of them has this darker brown wing panel, and this other one over here on the right is kind of pale. But also notice their bill patterns. This one has kept a black bill, and this one now has a bicolored bill. For no rhyme or reason, they have different bill patterns and different coloration on top. But overall, they look like they came from the same mold, the same ilk. Our herring gulls tend to fade really fast, and they get worn on the wing panel pretty quickly. Herring gulls on the East Coast actually have more durable plumages than our Great Lakes birds. So there are two populations, guys, and two different gene pools. Our herring gulls are a bit smaller on the Great Lakes, and the farther west you go, they're smaller. Your herring gulls in the eastern United States are some of the biggest herring gulls in the continent. So plumage variation, these are two adult herring gulls. This was taken in January in Florida. Notice the head streaking. So this one on the left here is pretty white-headed, and this one still has a lot of head and breast streaking. And this is not species specific. This is just natural variation. This one might be going into alternate plumage a little early, breeding plumage. And this one on the right just is hanging on to its basic plumage. Are there patterns to these things? There are some species that almost never take on any head streaking. So like if you think about great blackback gull, they tend to stay white-headed. The adults stay white-headed most of the year. If you go out west, like California or Washington or Oregon, their western gulls stay white-headed most of the year. So there are some species that don't take on a lot of head streaking. Herring gull is kind of random. You'll find one that has a white head, and then right next to it, one with a lot of head streaking. Okay. Along these lines of plumage variation, we have laughing gulls in the foreground. Laughing gulls in the foreground. There are these medium gray birds right here. Oops. So, but then there's a ring-billed here, paler gray, about the size of a laughing gull, a little bit bigger. This was in a landfill in Florida, and I've already hinted at what you can see in those landfills in Florida. Lots of lesser blackback gulls. That's what these bigger ones are. They're lesser blackbacks, but you might notice one of them is pretty pale. This one here. Some lesser blackbacks can be just as pale as laughing gull. And that's about the maximum paleness that you'll find in lesser blackback. Anything paler than a laughing gull, it's probably bordering on a hybrid. We want our lesser blackbacks to be no paler than laughing gull. But notice it's a bigger bird. They have yellow legs. And this is one of the species that takes on a lot of head streaking. All of these gulls are juvenile ring-billed gulls. I just want you to appreciate some of the variation in the tail patterns. So one thing that we look for with younger birds is their tail patterns, because there's a lot to be said about tail patterns. But if you are comfortable with variation, then you won't be so sold on just using one field mark to identify these first-year gulls. Because here's one with a really thin tail band, and then there's one here with a really dark tail. So this is the extreme on both ends. In general, ring builds tend to average about what you're seeing in this middle row right here. You guys have probably heard of common gull from Europe. Common gulls in Europe often have tail patterns that look like this one, or maybe like this one, or even this one. But their tail coverts tend to be pretty white with just a dark band. So anything with a lot of barring and spotting on the tail coverts is usually not a common gull. These are both herring gulls photographed on the same day in October in Michigan. Isn't it amazing that these are part of the same age cohort? So this is October. Both of these birds hatched that previous summer, months before. The one on the bottom we would categorize as like a Great Lakes bird. It's very faded. It has bleached, looks really bad. The one on top there has crisp, checkered upper parts, and it probably came from a northern pop. Anything with very fresh, crisp plumage through the fall and winter has probably come from a more northern latitude. That's generally true, guys, with these young white-headed or large white-headed gulls. The more durable the juvenile plumage, more likely they came from northern latitudes, Canada and the Arctic region. Here are 4 herring gulls. This will blow you away. All of these birds photographed on the same day, same parking lot, Northern Illinois. They're all herring gull. A typical Great Lakes bird would be something like this. Notice how it's faded. It's kind of worn. This one might be a Great Lakes bird. But then these other two, crisp, checkered, good condition, juvenile plumage, they may have come from somewhere farther north or hatched later. But I want you to know this variation sometimes trips people up. They start thinking they're looking at different species. If you look at herring gulls long enough, you'll notice they're a lot like snowflakes. There's almost no two that are alike. How about these two? Are these both herring gulls? I mean, there is a pretty substantial size difference in the bill. Check out this big honking bill here. And this one looks pretty petite compared to that. Body size difference. If you look at the back feathers, the scapulars right here, those are pretty dark. And I don't think that's variation. I think we're looking at a blackback species. And this is indeed a second-year great blackback gull. This is a second-year great blackback gull on the left. Big body, blackish scapulars. And then the smaller one is a herring gull. So great blackback on the left, bigger body, blackish scapulars. And then this one here is a herring gull. There are some herring gulls, big males, that can be just as big as smaller female great blackback gulls. So if you're on the ocean in the summer and these birds look really raggedy, size is very helpful in the summer when they're worn and faded and bleached. But in the winter, plumage is helpful because they're not that worn or faded. You guys, I know, have probably thought about Iceland gulls and Thayer's gulls and glaucus gulls, because those are the neat things to watch in the winter. Some people wait all year to see these paler species. Can you make out the Iceland gull in this flock of herrings? 3 of these are herrings. One of them is an Iceland gull. One of them is actually what I would think is bordering on Thayer's. It looks good for Thayer's. And other 3 are herring gulls. So if you're picking this one on the left here, this is our Thayer's gull. This one right here is the Thayer's. And if you notice, its primaries here, they tend to be paler. They tend to have some nice frosty edging. Overall, it just looks like a neater bird, less contrast on the upper parts. And that's generally what you're looking for, just kind of a frosty bird, less contrast on the upper parts, and some pale chevrons on the primaries. The herring gulls tend to be contrasty, right? They're kind of messy. The scapulars have one pattern. The wing coverts have another pattern. The primaries are contrasting, darker than the rest of the body. With Iceland gulls, they're a lot more uniform. Okay. Now this is fun because these are 4 different species. I'm not going to headache your brain with this because it would, I think, just be a frustration for most of our people who are just getting into gulls. If you're going to take on gull identification, it's said that you should always begin with adults. Because when you begin with first year and juvenile birds like this, a lot of them have this like nondescript plumage that kind of looks like 3 or 4 different other species. But believe in me, folks, these are 4 different species. And if you know what these are, bravo. I'm just going to quickly put these up here for confirmation. That's a Thayer's. That's a herring. This one's a California gull. If you're anywhere Rockies and west of the Rockies, you'll see these quite commonly. And this is a lesser blackback gull. Isn't it amazing? These lesser blackback gulls have this very long wing projection, very svelte looking, sleek birds, dark black bill. But I want to show you these 4 as adults because that's where we should be focusing. Here's what they look like 4 years later, 3.5 years later. They're now adults. And the leg color helps. The gray coloration or black on the back helps. Eye color helps. All of those field marks combined allow us to make good identifications. Your benchmark species obviously is herring gull because this is going to be your most common large gull in eastern North America. Herring gulls just have kind of a pale gray back, pink legs, pale eyes. Some are large, some are not so large. There's size variation in the body. But Thayer's and Iceland gulls, we're looking for a more docile looking bird, more white in the primaries. And what I mean by that, folks, is right here. You might notice there's white that kind of hooks around on the outer or inner side of the wings here. Whereas with these herrings, it looks like black and white, black and white. And on the Thayer's, the white kind of hooks around into these what look like apostrophe marks. California gull, you're probably not going to see one in central Massachusetts unless you're like David Sibley or something. But you know, their gray upper parts should pop in a flock. If you have a California gull, here's one here, yellow legs, darker gray upper parts, it's going to stick out in a group of herring gulls. Some are just about as big as herring gulls, some are a little bit smaller, but they have a dark eye that's pretty constant, and yellow legs. But notice the medium gray upper parts. My daughter actually picked this bird out in Michigan. This is a good bird for us on Lake Michigan. What's the darker one there? So if a child can pick out the darker one, so can birders. They're not that hard if they're in a flock. You're looking for these subtle differences in gray, and you'll find one if they're in there. More on these bare parts. So bare parts, again, is just anything that doesn't have feathers. The skin around the eye, the orbital ring, the legs, the bill, all these things are known as bare parts. They can be helpful features. So for example, in Thayer's, they tend to have this kind of greenish cast to their bill. Some of them, not all of them. And about 80% of Thayer's have dark eyes. And what's funny about this is if you look at the other subspecies of Iceland gull, this is Kumlien's gull. This is the Canadian intermediate form of Iceland gull. They're beautiful birds. And I was just in St. John's, Newfoundland last week where I saw a few thousand of these. And they are just so variable as adults. They can have gray wingtips, black wingtips, white wingtips. It's probably a hybrid population. We're not sure if it's even a valid taxon, but Kumlien's gull often will show this nice pink orbital ring. And don't rely on eye color because they're going to be dark-eyed, light-eyed. They're just all over the map with eye color, with wingtip color. But overall, they tend to be more compact than herring gull. Their bills tend to be a little bit shorter. Overall, they just look a little more compact. We do have this neat thing with about 5% of gulls, about 5%, maybe a little bit less than that, where they have heterochromia. It's quite common actually in herring gulls. We'll have one dark eye, one pale eye. You'll see this sometimes with like cats and dogs. It's really crazy because you might be scanning and then you see a dark-eyed gull and you think you got something special like a Thayer's or a California gull, and then it turns its head and it's just the pale-eyed or heterochromia herring gull. Bear parts, again, how useful is leg color here? Very useful, but also combine that with size, and it looks like we have two different species here. These are two you should know. They're your only two blackbacks out east. The big one on the left with pink legs, great blackback, and the smaller one on the right with yellow legs, lesser blackback. Big size difference, and leg colors definitely helpful. And I'll kind of wrap it up in just a couple minutes here. I just want to point out both of these are also lesser blackback gulls. How is that? The one on the right has the right eye or leg color, mustard yellow. But the one on the left has these ambiguous looking, fleshy, pinkish colored legs. And it just doesn't feel right. And the reason for that is because it's not a definitive adult. These third-year lesser blackback gulls, notice, guys, it doesn't have any white spots here, no white apicals. Has a lot of black on the bill. So this is a third cycle or a third year lesser blackback. They can have pinkish legs all the way up until this age here. And this really drives people nuts, especially in the interior, where lesser blackback has become, you know, the new slatyback gull. Anything that looks like a third year lesser blackback, people are calling slatyback gull because slatybacks have pink legs. But just watch out for these age-related field marks. If you're wondering about the band on this bird on the right here, this is Pierre. That's his name. Pierre is a lesser blackback gull that was found hybridizing with herring gulls on Appledore Island in Maine, off the coast of Maine. And they actually captured this bird and banded it. And for about 6 or 7 years, it would migrate south and winter off of Daytona Beach shores in Florida. And birders would photograph it there and they would see it there and report it. And then it would disappear around March and pop up at Appledore Island in May and June. And for a few years, it came back. It was hybridizing with herring gulls, producing these hybrid chicks. The hybrid chicks were banded with green bands like this. They also were found in places like Massachusetts, off Cape Cod. They were found in places like Alabama and North Carolina. And then it just fell off the map. This was very recent, guys. This is about 10, 15 years ago. And you expect these birds to live, 20, 25 years, but the hybrids fell off the map. Pierre fell off the map. They're nowhere to be found. But if you notice these bands, these green bands, they're often found in the Northeast on the Atlantic. They come from Appledore Island in Maine. There's a banding program there that bands about 500 herrings and great blackbacks every June. So report them. When you see them, report them to the bird banding lab. That would be greatly appreciated. And then finally, lesser blackback gull. This third cycle, a moment ago, I talked about all that black on the bill. Some plumage features you would see on a subadult are like, the dark wash on the tail. That's a sign that this bird is not an adult. The dark on the underwing here, that's a sign that this bird is not an adult, because adults would have all white on the underwing. But it gets kind of fun when it's a little more subtle than this, and is this a third year? Is this a fourth year? What is that? That's a big part of the fascination with gulls is if you get tired of adults, you can go on to third cycles. And if you get tired of third cycles, you can go to second cycles. For people who are nuts about gulls, it's like seeing 4 different things that have 4 different ages. because each one has its own special, unique features, and you can kind of discuss those things at length. I'm going to end with this slide that will hopefully reinforce some terminology you probably read or seen in your field guides. But I think one of the turnoffs with gulls, at least for beginning birders, is we often use so much jargon that, you know, for people who are coming to bird watching just to relax, it seems like a lot of homework. And quite the opposite. I think it could be very rewarding, very enriching. It can actually make you a better birder if you familiarize yourself with these feather tracks. And not only do they apply to gulls, they also apply to things like ducks and raptors and other big birds that you can see out in the open. You can actually quite easily make out these feather tracks. You know, the back feathers here, we call scapulars. Some people just call this whole region the mantle. But the scapulars, these are some of the first feathers to be replaced on most of our birds. The longest feathers that you see here, these are the primaries, not the tail, but the primaries. So when the bird has its wings spread, these are the feathers at the very, very wingtip. Right above those primaries are feathers protecting them called the tertials. These tertials you can't see in flight. Once the bird opens up its wings, those tertials tend to hide underneath the scapulars, so they're not very visible in flight. And then on the wing panel, there's several tracks. You should know the lower and longest ones are called the greater coverts or coverts. The ones right above them are called the median coverts or coverts. I'll do this in blue. These are median here. And then there's all these little rows of smaller coverts called the lesser coverts or marginal coverts. And, you know, even with songbirds, sometimes there'll be like a wing bar that you want to see. So you have to know, is it on the median coverts? Is it on the greater coverts? With ducks, it's quite helpful actually. And then those other things we can just leave for another time. A quick quiz. I'm going to point to things and you guys can just yell it out at home. What are these feathers here called? These are the tertials, the tertials. Okay, and right about here on the back, those are the scapulars, the scapulars. Here, this long row of coverts, the greater coverts. Above them are the median coverts. You can see that row right there. And these random rows, there's 3 or 4 just displaced rows. They're not very neatly arranged. Those are the lesser coverts, right? Good. And then the primaries. The primaries tend to be more important with adults. We're looking for patterns on the adults. With younger birds, they're all pretty much brownish black and nondescript. Okay. That is your introduction to gull ID. We've talked about small gulls, also known as tern-like gulls, and the large gulls, the 4-year gulls, which are a lot of fun. This is the time of year to get out and practice. You can't practice in June. You'll be looking at other breeding birds. Get out there, folks. Go find some pond, some parking lot, some river to practice some of what you learned here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. That was excellent. That I feel like we're ready to get like certificates or something after.
Oh, you guys should be rewarded for putting up with an hour of this.
Yeah, if you like print out that last photo with the feathers and like just blanks to fill in and see if we remember which are there you go. Anybody who can fill in all the blanks of each of those feather groups without them, you know, should definitely win some kind of prize.
Just because I know this is being recorded, I'm going to leave this slide up here. And the answer key to this, folks, for anybody who
stop that. There we go.
No problem. So the answer key to this, just so it's on the record here, is right here. Okay, that's an open wing. And, if you get into these technical articles and some of the more detailed field guides, it's nice to know the names of these feathers. Okay, should we open it up to some questions?
Yeah, it's about that time. We've got we definitely have a lot of compliments coming in the chat column here. There was one question earlier, which I think you actually answered after the question was posted, but you asked about or the question was asking about using eye color as a field mark for identification. So which you noted that in some cases the same gull has two different color eyes. So are there situations where eye color is useful, or is it typically not reliable in most situations?
Yeah, so for my upcoming field guide, I have this kind of nifty chart that has a column on eye color, and it shows which species have variable eye color. And about half of large white-headed gulls have variable eye color. So great blackback gull is one of them. They can have medium colored, honey colored eyes. They can have palish eyes, darker eyes. So they're kind of variable. But herring gull in general, adults should have pale eyes. You'll almost never see a herring gull with two dark eyes. So if you see a herring gull with two dark eyes, it's probably not a herring gull. But if you see one with a dark and a light eye, that's pretty common with herring. California gulls, for example, should have dark eyes. That's pretty fixed. Adult ring-billed gulls should be pale-eyed. So there are some species where eye color is very helpful. With the smaller gulls, the tern-like gulls, things like Bonapartes and kittiwakes and those things, they all pretty much have dark eyes.
Yeah, I recall the one, maybe only time that I saw a Thayer's back when Thayer's was considered a separate species. I know the other folks watching it were making a big deal of the fact it was a full adult but had dark eyes, and that in other cases, the gulls would have, other gull species would have dark eyes when they're younger, but then become pale-eyed as adults.
Yeah, so some other things that are dark-eyed, like glaucous wing gull. If you're ever in Alaska, that's one of the most common large gulls there. Glaucous wing gull is generally dark-eyed. And California, short-billed gull, which was recently known as mew gull. Short-billed gull has variable eye color. Lesser blackback should be pale-eyed. That's a constant for the most part. I've never seen an adult lesser blackback with dark eyes.
Hey, you mentioned toward the end of your talk the common gull, and now the short-billed gull, which some folks may not entirely be familiar with all the changes. So I've got my Sibley Guide to Birds here, and after you brought up common gulls, I decided to flip through it and saw there. If you look in the index under gulls, common gull is not listed in this. This is the 2000 edition of David's book. So so common gull became a thing more recently than 2000. Can you cover kind of the changes, where it all came from and where it's at now? So
here's the thing. There are people in Europe that refer to their common gull as mew gull. But then we hijacked the name for our subspecies and we called our race mew gull. And it just became a thing where we called ours mew gull, and they kind of shied away from that and they started to refer to their subspecies as common gull. So when the split happened, I don't know how long the split was, a year or 2 years ago, when our subspecies Brachyrhynchus got split, they had to change the name because there's this confusion historically where the Europeans used mew gull for their race or for the whole complex. So we reverted back to short-billed gull. That was the name that our mew gull had before it became a subspecies of common gull. But common gull is just a recent thing where Europeans just started calling their subspecies common gull. Historically, it was known as mew gull, but then there was confusion when we started to call ours mew gull. Common gull now, folks, has 3 subspecies. There's the nominate race Canis that you find in places like Ireland, Britain, Norway, Western Europe. There's a Russian subspecies called Heinii. It's an intermediate race, and they're the least known ones. And then there's the Asian subspecies called Kamchatka, and they nest in Siberia, Northeast Russia. Somewhere between Kamchatka and common gull is this Heinii subspecies that, some of them look like Kamchatkas, some of them look like common gulls. And amazingly, there was one found in Cleveland a couple weeks ago. If you guys have heard this buzz about the common gull found on Lake Erie in Cleveland, well, it wasn't identified as subspecies. It doesn't look like it's a Western European common gull. It looks like something between Kamchatka and Heinii. But that whole complex still needs more work. Our subspecies, which was recently promoted to species status, is Brachyrhynchus, and it's now known as short-billed gull. And they nest in Alaska and Canada, and you'll find them wintering right now all the way down to California. They tend to have the most distinct voice, the most distinct bill pattern, wingtip pattern. So they're definitely not part of that old world group, but the old world group is now known as common gull, and it has 3 subspecies. I know Massachusetts, I believe, has had both common gull Canis from Western Europe and Kamchatka gull, which is pretty special. This Kamchatka gull has just popped up out of nowhere in the last 15 years. If you guys have heard it on the rare bird alerts, Kamchatka gull, it's a pretty big bird. It could be just as dark as lesser blackback. And some of them are even bigger than ring-billed gulls. So they're pretty powerful birds. I hope that helps, Josh. There's some questions in the chat here that I'm trying to get to while I'm talking here. Thank you, everybody. But there's one here that says, when you're in the field and you encounter a group of subadult gulls of different species, is there a particular order to the field marks as you examine them? You'd be amazed how helpful it is to look at the scapulars, the scapular patterns. Are you guys seeing this feather track quiz slide? I'm not sure. Yeah, is it up there? So the scapulars usually have distinctive patterns. The greater coverts usually have distinctive patterns. So as I'm doing a quick scan, I'm looking at the scapular patterns. Are they new or are they old? Are they very highly patterned? Are they plain? So those sort of things, when you start to categorize them as these are plain, these are checkered, these are pale, these are dark. That's one thing I do with these subadults, but also the underparts. So like this is a lesser blackback, guys. Lesser blackbacks tend to have a pretty pale body overall. If you look at the undertail coverts here, this vent region, this is the vent right here. They tend to be pretty pale on the vent. Whereas if this was a herring, it would be pretty dark and pretty patterned, a lot of barring. So that's one thing that's helpful with these younger birds. But unfortunately, there's no easy way to kind of approach this with the subadults. A lot of it comes with practice, but then usually if there's something different in there, 1 or 2 different birds, they'll usually stand out and you can kind of make out some differences and go from there. Next question says, sorry, it's not specifically a gull question, but near the beginning of the presentation, I think you mentioned that gulls don't revert to a juvenile state after becoming adults. What birds revert to juvenile states? And is it just a state of the plumage or is it also size? I may put my foot in my mouth with that, but I'm thinking of things like some warblers that, when they molt out their breeding plumage, they might overlap with some of the first year birds. Can anybody think of an example here? So like you have a adult warbler, male maybe, in breeding plumage, and then it molts out of that plumage, and it might tend to look just like a first year. I'm sure there's examples with songbirds, maybe like a Blackburnian or something, or Blackpoll. But this is something that came up in a talk where someone was feeding gulls in a parking lot for years, this lady, and she thought the adult gulls were molting back into like a drab brown plumage. Canada warbler might be one. But so that's the point I was trying to make here, is like those gray backs and white heads, they're going to stay that way. They don't come back to this brownish drab looking plumage like some songbirds might when they go back to non-breeding plumage. That was the intended message there.
So you do get some of the gulls get like the white adults get like a dark streaking on the head, but it's not, it's very different from the kind of murky pattern on the young birds.
Yeah. So like these gulls here, guys, they're a non-breeding plumage or basic plumage. That head streaking is kind of what gives it away. And their bare parts might become duller, like the leg color is not as vivid. The bill colors might become a little washed out, but they'll never lose that gray on the back and the white bodies. They pretty much stay in that plumage. What do we have here? You're welcome.
If you're looking for more questions, there was one earlier on, which something you and I talked about also, about vocalizations. And you mentioned with one of the Mughal kind of splits that one had a more distinctive voice. And it had also come up when you and I were talking about James Smith's yellow-legged, maybe, gull from Turner's Falls several years ago. So what about vocalizations and identification?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that helped determine that it wasn't a yellow-legged gull, because it didn't sound like one. They have pretty deep voices. They have distinctive voices. They sound pretty different than herring and lesser blackback. But the hybrids that I've heard, and lesser blackback herring hybrid, guys, is a formidable foe. Let me tell you, there are a lot of lesser blackback herring hybrids on the Atlantic right now. They seem to be increasing every year. I go down to Florida every January for some gull watching because there's amazing gull watching in Florida. And you can find, out of a group of 300 or 400 herrings, you can find 1 or 2 hybrid lesser blackback herrings. Also in Pennsylvania, they seem to be pretty popular. Massachusetts on the coast, they seem to be pretty popular. Those hybrids, for whatever reason, they tend to sound more like herring gulls. Whereas yellow-legged gulls, like real yellow-legged gulls from Europe, they have these deeper sounds to them. So I know this was something they used with that bird from, is it Turner Falls?
Turner's Falls.
Turner's Falls, yeah. Gulls in parking lots, the best. I've found some of my best gulls in parking lots, and I know this sounds creepy for somebody to be sitting in a parking lot, but you got to go to empty parking lots near landfills. A lot of landfills don't allow birder access anymore. Like it's just gotten harder and harder to get into landfills. But if you can find somewhere close to a landfill, gulls will often use these parking lots to preen, to rest, to just kind of relax, because parking lots will often get plowed, so they're nice and clean for them. The rooftops will often be filled with snow, which isn't good for them. That's their second go-to. They usually go to rooftops if they're not on water or ice. But parking lots near landfills can be amazing. I've found an adult slaty-back gull in this parking lot near a landfill. And in that same parking lot, I've found an adult ivory gull about 4 or 5 years apart in the same parking lot.
That's quite a parking lot.
Yes, it's literally, several hundred feet from a landfill. So the gulls will leave the hilltop. And if you're in your car and you throw out some cat food, some dry food, they're feeding in the landfill, and they come to this dry cat food, and they will munch it up really fast and bring all their friends. And now instead of having 15 gulls, you have 200 gulls. And there are so many good gulls hiding in these landfills in the winter. We just get to never see them. They leave the landfill and they go straight to their roost. And oftentimes those roosts are inaccessible, or the birds are really distant and hard to see. But if you can get during the day near a landfill parking lot, I don't think you'll regret it.
Excellent. Well, if there are no further questions, I think this is the point where the in-person, if there was an in-person audience, yeah, we'd all stand up and give you a standing ovation.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
But it doesn't work as well on Zoom, so.
No, a little impersonal.
But if you ever come east to Massachusetts and want to do another program, let me know you're coming. And
absolutely, would be thrilled to. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks for coming, everyone. See you all next month for John Kreitcher's program. So
thank you.
Thanks again, Amar.
You're welcome.